This is Songwriters Room, and I'm your host, Tomoko. Today's guest is Oscar Deric Brown. Oscar is a pianist, composer, producer, and arranger. He is one of not only the most talented, but also the most versatile musicians I know because the spectrum of his talented work has no boundaries. He was first a classically trained piano prodigy. He has 8 of his own solo projects, but worked on countless numbers of other projects and with so many big names in all genres, such as, you ready? Herbie Hancock, Keith Jarrett, Bill Evans, David Sanborn, Ray Charles, Little Richard, Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Eddie Kendricks, Shalamar, Santana, Madonna, Annie Lennox, Grace Jones, Blondie, Eddie Van Halen, White Snakes, Nona Hendrix, and the list goes on and on and on. He's produced film scores directed by Wim Wenders, Robert Redford, and currently working for the movie by Sofia Coppola.
Yeah, Coppola.
Sofia Coppola.
Coppola.
Furthermore, he's also worked with famous Japanese idols such as Ryuichi Sakamoto, Miki Imai, Dreams Come True, Tsutomu Yamashita, just to name a few. And for the great Hanshin earthquake that happened in 1995, he produced the CD project called Rainbow Color Lotus for the benefit and brought 100 worldwide musicians to Japan to do a benefit concert, the World Music Festival Kobe, which it was broadcasted by NHK, featuring Herbie Hancock, Ryuichi Sakamoto, and many other giants. And not only his music, but Oscar himself has an ethnic background, which is also multicultural, with Native American, African American, and Jewish background. And his daughter and son are half Japanese. His daughter is now living in Japan, getting very popular as a singer there as well. But most of all, he's one of the sweetest human beings I know and a dear friend of mine. Amen.
Amen.
Today, he will share with us his interesting personal stories working with these people, and then maybe he can give us a quick songwriting crash course and some advice about the key to collaborate with others, because that's all he's done all his life. Can I get a whoop whoop? So without further ado, please welcome Oscar Deric Brown.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Oscar. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I know your company is called Brilliant Color Works, and
that's correct.
You know, you had such a colorful, literally colorful life working with all these stars and interesting people, and have countless fascinating stories that we can talk about all day for the whole week. But, you know, we don't have that enough time, but I definitely want to hear some of your condensed versions of your interesting experiences and encounters, like how you started playing piano so early and you're live in LA, working at Motown, then moved to New York, where you reside right now. So how did you start working at the Motown?
Oh, wow. Well, there was an incredible bass player and arranger I met when I was about 17, 18 years old, Norman Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
And his brother is a famous painter sculptor, Daniel LaRue Johnson, who was one of the first African Americans to get the Guggenheim Award, you know, the prestigious Guggenheim.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Danny lived in New York and Norman lived in LA, and I had been playing a lot of local gigs with him around town very earlier on with Harvey Mason. Harvey had just moved from Boston. He went to Berkeley School of Music, and but Norman so happened to own a studio, a really high-tech studio at that time called Poppy Recording Studio. He's the first African American to own a recording studio of that caliber in Los Angeles.
Wow.
And the only other person I think before him was Sam Cooke. But at any rate, a lot of famous people had already recorded at that studio, and they did a lot of jazz music like Charles Lloyd and Gerald Wilson. The Gerald Wilson Orchestra recorded there, and somewhere around the late '60s, early '70s, '69, '70, he had to sell the studio. There was in a horrible divorce, and one of the conditions out of the divorce, he had to sell the studio. So Berry Gordy was moving his operation from Detroit to Los Angeles, and had heard about the studio, came and visited the studio, and fell in love with it, and said, "I want it. Motown will buy this studio."
Was it huge?
Very large facility. I would say somewhere around almost 4,000 square feet or more. Unusually for Los Angeles, they had a basement. And at that time, I mopped the floor, brought coffee, and went to the store, to buy alcohol, which I wasn't supposed to. Anything that was needed for the session, clean the bathroom. I did that. And I did that all the way up to the point. It was one day I was in I guess you could call it cafeteria, and I was at the table and I was writing out parts from this score. And Barry saw me. He said, "You write music?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, this is your handwriting?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "You're hired."
Wow.
So I said, "What?" He says, "Yeah, we need a copyist."
Wow.
So basically, I was hired as a copyist, and there was another guy who was a producer, songwriter, and a businessman named Skip Scarborough, and he had all these different teams of people that he put together, songwriters, arrangers, writers, copyists like me. I got a chance to work with Skip Scarborough. He was very, very influenced when Earth, Wind, and Fire first formed. So many other opportunities that happened at that time because of the circle of people that I was in. '69, beginning of '69, '70, I became the apprentice for composer, saxophonist Oliver Nelson. Oliver wrote the music for Last Tango in Paris.
Oh!
I was his apprentice when he worked on that score with Gato Barbieri. Incredible musicians. And so we played around town, clubs, strip joints, anywhere we could make money. Actually, I think that's the first gig where I made $1,000 was at a strip joint. But this was a very interesting time in American music. I think the crossover was that jazz music was prevalent everywhere. If you listen to the drum sound in all the Motown records, that's a jazz drum sound. That's a jazz kit. Drums were not muffled. They were very open, overtones. You listen to all the four tops, the spinners, that Motown sound was the 18-inch bass drum.
Jazz musicians use it all together and they didn't get the credit, right?
No, Motown didn't put credits on the records. They didn't. They put the artist's name, but they didn't say who was playing bass, who played guitar. Unless to the LP. Remember, the biggest thing was singles, and the singles had just a minimal amount of information, including the copyright. What you didn't make in one session, you made up in doing other sessions. There was so much work. And the only thing they would swap out was the engineer, because the engineer's ears would burn out. But they would run that studio pretty much 24/7. And then there's a level of trust. There's like I've heard the name Click used a lot. Click has two meanings. One sort of like a family, and the other is like just for us, Click. And the Motown, it was more like a family of people that were put together because they were trusted. They could depend on these people and lean on them, especially when things got difficult. And sometimes it did. It got difficult.
Would you say Berry Gordy treated everybody fairly?
He was he was a beautiful human being.
Mm.
He treated everybody like kings and queens. Other people he had worked underneath him. I've heard a lot of other stories about him, the money and stuff like that. I never saw anything like that.
Okay.
You know, but then I'm not an artist. I'm just a behind the scenes person. He learned so much is how to collaborate with people,
Mm-hmm.
how to listen. You know, the
Mm-hmm.
key to understanding is listening. And if you're talking all the time, you can't learn anything.
Mm-hmm.
So sitting in the room with these people,
Mm-hmm.
just listening, seeing how things were put together in such a really a magical way. A lot of love for the craft. They talk about music, but they don't talk
Mm.
about the craft, inspiration that goes before you get there, before you arrive to the studio. But any of these musicians, Bernard Purdy or any of them, play the way they did if they didn't practice. If they
Mm-hmm.
didn't love the craft of working hard, you know, because there's no guarantee in anything. Think
Mm-hmm.
about it. And music is the ultimate expression of that, living in the
Mm-hmm.
moment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but songwriting. I mean, here's the real magical part of it. The idea of riff on the spot. Do 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 do. And it's just simple like that. You know, like that. And forget about the lead vocalist or the melody, but just the idea of the call and response.
Right.
My girl was Smokey would sing something. Sometimes he would just sing the bass part, and then whoever was the bass player of the day would pick it up right there on the spot. They would sing the parts out.
Right.
Later, they got written out, you know, because they were doing sheet music back then. But
Mm-hmm.
they were sung. Everything was sung, put together.
You also worked with my favorite vocalist, Donny Hathaway. Tell me about that.
Oh, with Donnie. I knew Donnie. I met Donnie in '69. He was like a beautiful cat, telling
Mm.
jokes, always funny. You
Mm.
know, would play pranks on you. Used to make fun of
Really?
me and my big afro. I had a big afro. This is before Donnie had a hit. You know, this is before the ghetto anything. I don't think he had a record deal then. And
Wow.
he was out performing the ghetto before he had the deal.
So you worked with all these beautiful people in LA, and what made you move to New York?
I moved to New York because of the live music, the opportunity to play and perform with other artists.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that prepared me for New York was San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And San Francisco, Sly and the Family Stone was there. So I met Sly in my first year that I moved to San Francisco. There was a studio called that became Fantasy Studios.
Mm-hmm.
There was another studio called Different Third.
Mm-hmm.
And Sly did a lot of recording there.
Mm-hmm.
So I met Greg Enrico, his drummer, and Larry Graham. And it was through that interchange that I met a bass player named Doug Roush. Everybody gives Larry Graham the credit for playing the thumb.
Right.
But you can look up Doug Roush.
Okay.
He's the other guy.
Right. They only talk about Larry Graham.
Yeah. Dougie played with Santana. And before that, he played in a lot of bands here in New York. He started out with the Boys Choir of Harlem. And so he was from the East Coast music scene, and he moved to San Francisco. And Dougie and I became very close. Through him, I met George Duke.
Woo!
I would go to George's house and take lessons from him.
What?
Yeah, man. George hooked me up. He hooked me up on a lot of gigs when I got there. George was really cool. And George introduced me to a lot of people. Coke and Pete Escovedo, who had a band called Azteca. That's Sheila E.'s father and uncle. They had a hook on the music scene. Latin club called Caesars
Mm-hmm.
in San Francisco. Weather Report was going on tour.
Mm.
And this is the second band with Eric Ravat, Don Ramal, the percussionist, Alphonse Mouzon on drums, Wayne Shorter, tenor saxophone, and
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Zavenu
Mm-hmm.
on drums. Joe asked me to come out to be a roadie for him.
You did a loadie for Weather Report?
Yes, I did. And on that tour, I was studying all the time, you know, with Wayne and Joe. And Joe showed me his system of using motifs, short groups of
Yes.
melodies and combining them together to make new compositions. In other words, instead of having to write the whole composition in a linear form from start to beginning, he would do these short phrases, you know, no more than 4 measures, 4 bars. And he would sequence them together. We got to say here sequence them, but he would write them and put them together, and that would become the composition. So him and Wayne, Joe and Wayne, were experimenting with this type of format to paint and make new music, you know. And so I learned this from Joe and Wayne while I was with them. Changed. It was a whole West Coast tour. At the end of that, my ear changed, and I remember talking to Wayne because it was Wayne's suggestion that I go to New York. Wayne said, "Hey man, you're ready for New York." He says, "We're on the road all the time. I hardly live in LA." And so he said, "The only chance you're going to get to work 7 days a week as a musician is to go to New York." Herbie moved to LA. I found Herbie his house that he lives in now.
What?
A friend of mine was a real estate agent and told me about this house up on Doheny, and she came by and picked me up, and Herbie's cousin, we used to call him Chop, came by and picked up me and Herbie, and we drove to that house on Doheny.
By the way, how did he become a Buddhist?
Oh, wow. I was there.
You were there?
Yeah. I was there when he was Shakabuku. They call it Shakabuku. You had two parallel forces. At the same time that was happening, Scientology was happening. It was starting to grow up. And then another polar force was meditation. You had several yogis. You had Yogananda, and then Sri Chamoy, who Carlos Santana had become a devotee to. Carlos introduced me to Sri Chamoy. He brought me to my first meditation with Sri.
Interesting.
But Herbie had brought me to my first meeting.
Soka Gakkai in Japanese.
It didn't call it Soka Gakkai back then. Nishu and Shoshu. And then much later on, when it became a big organization, they had the translation to the scroll. We were learning the mudras just by verbally. There were no booklets. I remember we were learning that by the person next to you. It's almost like singing. And even Nam Yoho Renge Kyu, you know, even that which is a vibration.
Yes.
We learned that by the person that was right next to you. I found myself only going because I wanted to meet some girl that was at the meeting, and that's where I stopped and I said, "This is not for me." It's just not.
Did you see Tina Turner there too?
Oh, I have a long story. I have a story about that.
I bet you do.
On the night that Tina Turner was running from Ike, she came to Wayne Shorter's house. Anna Maria, Wayne Shorter's wife, and Wayne's house that she came to.
Wow.
I was in the study with Wayne Shorter.
Wow.
Where he was working on some score, a new score for a large-scale project. And she came over, and her face was battered. I was there.
That's crazy.
And that was the night that she chanted, I think, for the first time.
So when are you going to write a book?
I actually started to put stuff together.
We have our mutual friend, Dennis Davis, the legendary drummer who used to play for Stevie Wonder, Roy Ayers, you know, David Bowie, George Benson, and who passed away of cancer a few years ago. He was my brother too, and but he's the one you told me that who like opened the door for you to work in New York.
Let me tell you a little bit about Dennis Davis. I met Dennis Davis in 1972 or 73 with Roy Ayers, and he used to always say, "Man, yeah, you got to come to New York. You got to come to New York." So he brought this drummer with him, Dennis, and I sat in with the band. I remember it was the last that I sat in with the band and played, and Harry Whitaker was his keyboard player at the time. And Harry and I really hooked up, became really good friends. And so Dennis gave me his number, and he says, "Hey, man, if you get to New York, look me up." The winter of 1976, my grandmother died. The night before that, my grandmother was apparently sick in the hospital, fighting some sort of virus or something. And I had a high temperature. And I was sick, and I called my dad and asked my dad if he would come and take me to the hospital because I was sick. but it was something like around 11 o'clock at night. He was getting dressed to come, and all of a sudden it was over with. The temperature was down. I wasn't in suffering anymore, and it was like I had a clarity, certain clarity. That
Mm-hmm.
is the exact moment that my grandmother died. So my mother found out the next morning when she called me, and my sisters witnessed it because she was there with my mom. My mom calls me and she says, "Your grandmother died." And the very next word I said of it, I said, "Mom, I'm moving to New York." And the phone was kind of silent for me. And she says, "What are you talking about? Can you just hear what I said? Your grandmother died." And I said, "Yeah, Mom, I know. If I don't go, I'm never gonna go. I gotta go. I've waited too long. I gotta move to New York."
That's interesting, Oscar, because I always move to another place when something like that happens too. When my
Yeah.
grandfather died, I moved to Tokyo because I thought I have to move right now or never. And
Or
then
never did. Hmm.
1997, when my mother passed away, I didn't want to leave my father alone there, but I had to live my life, and I told him that I'm moving to New York. So I can really relate to that.
Leo, right?
Yes,
Ah,
Leo.
Leo. Yep, yep. So I called Dennis. Dennis was back, and Dennis says, "Hey, man, yo, you in town?" I said, "Yeah." Wow. Listen, come to my house. I got a gig for you. So I went uptown. He lived. He had a loft uptown in the '80s.
Yes.
You know, and I got to his house, and he said, "Yo, man, tomorrow morning, Sammy Figueroa. See them drums? They belong to Sammy Figueroa. He's gonna come pick up his drums, and he's gonna take you to a session with a group called Change." You
That's
know?
Luther
I said,
Vandross
"Yep." Luther
previous.
Vandross was the lead singer. Luther was still in high school, and so that was my first gig playing on the Change record with Luther and Sammy Figueroa. We played on 13, 14 tracks that day.
Mm.
You know, I had only been in New York like 4 or 5 days, and I made over 10 grand on that record, cash. 1976.
You made ten
1976.
thousand dollars cash from one session with.
One record. Fred Petras, who was a producer, he was a gangster and a drug dealer. That was his other thing. They wound up killing him. He died a horrible death. Um,
Wow.
the mafia killed him. He didn't want a record of anything, you know. And Sammy told him, basically, he had burned Sammy for some money before. I found out later he hadn't paid Sammy, and in order for Sammy to come and do the session, plus he was bringing me. They pumped me up like I was like some big guy from LA to play the Motown and blah 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 blah. So we got paid probably on the triple scale or something like that.
Wow.
The musicianship went from here to like this
Mm.
between New York and LA. Yeah, the different types of music. I went from playing uh, R&B to rock and roll, hardcore rock and roll, to reggae music, to, I mean, in one day I could play 5 different types of music.
Did you tell me that you played with Bob Marley too?
Yeah. Well, I didn't play with Bob. I played with Bobby and Sly Dunbar. And then I worked with Rita Marley. Rita Marley
Wow.
started, after Bob died, she started Tough Gong, a label called Tough Gong. And then a second label called Ghetto Youth. And the investors to that company were Japanese company in Osaka. So I produced Damon Marley and Ziggy, Mr. Gong, Andrew Bees from Black Uhuru. I was spending a lot of time going back between Jamaica and New York then. Here was my circle. Uh, Tokyo, Osaka, Jamaica.
So when were you living in Japan?
Oh, wow. I had permanent residence in Japan between January of 1990 all the way up into 1994.
4 years.
Yep. Osaka a lot. Back and forth Osaka. Because
Mm-hmm.
some of the artists I worked with were there. There were a couple studios we worked out of there. Unkyo, and then I'm working with MUSE Japan and MUSE America, and most of MUSE was a big management company. Between them and HORI PRO,
HORI PRO,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I worked there. I was contracted from them, so I had major management agents and managers and publishers.
Did you learn to speak Japanese?
I learned enough to protect myself because I learned, especially in new relationships. They would say one or two things in English and they'd talk the rest in Japanese, which means and then I would spot out what they were saying and I said, "Oh, well, listen," because they were talking about what they were going to pay me, and I said, "Well, no, you're going to pay me this."
You said that in Japanese?
No, in English. But once they knew I understood what they were saying, that shit was silent right away. Because they knew they couldn't get me. Imagine, this is at the highest point with before the bubble broke in Japan. A square foot in Shinjuku was $1 million per square foot.
Yeah.
So the economy was booming. This is before Japan started to export labor to China. The yen, it was better to be paid in yen than U.S. dollars.
It was 2-3 times more than now.
I had major endorsements from Ford, Yamaha, a bunch of different Roland. I had endorsements from all three companies. They were just giving me instruments, and it was a wonderful time for a musician. There was this artist that I worked with, Minako Yoshida.
Yoshida Minako, yes.
I met her through Sakamoto.
Mm-hmm.
She was married to Sakamoto's manager, Ike. This is during the period of The Last Emperor, when right before they were starting to work on The Last Emperor.
Interesting.
And Sakamoto and I were hanging like this. And Yoshida was working on her new record. And we talked about collaborating on some songs. And we did a lot of writing together. And then Aki died. Aki was killed in an auto accident in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So he was there partying and doing his thing and had a rent-a-car, open-top rent-a-car. And it started raining, and the car got out of control, went off the cliff. And that was the biggest change for Sakamoto. His career changed after that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The year before that, they had just got the Oscar they got the Academy Awards
mm-hmm.
for The Last Emperor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is right around that period. I met Miles earlier in my teens when I was in high school, but I had moved to New York, and Tio Marcero, who was Miles Davis' producer, called me one day and said, "Look, we're trying to get Miles back into the studio. As you know, Miles has been recluse to his house. He hasn't come out in several years. So we're trying to get Miles back in the studio, and I'd like you to go and audition for Miles." So I said, "Wow, of course." So I went to Miles' house on 77th Street, and I auditioned for Miles in the basement of his house. He had a little small piano, like a spinet. He also had a Fender Rhodes there. Both of them were so badly out of tune. And I remember I called Herbie, and I asked Herbie, "Hey, man, Gil Michelle called me to go to Miles' house." And we both laughed. We were laughing like kids. He says, "Yeah." I said, "What should I play?" Well, Miles likes ballads. Play him a ballad. So when I got to the house, I played Round Midnight. And at the end of it, you could hear a pin fall. And this is on a badly out of tune piano. And the room was very dark because it's in the basement of his place. And he said, "Yeah, man, nice touch." About 2 months later, I got called by Tio Macero, and he asked me about bass players, who I liked as a bass player. And I told him T.M. Stevens, because I've been playing a lot with T.M. So they called T.M. Stevens, and we're at Columbia Studio. And long story short, Miles never showed up to the session. Never came. Supposedly he had done that several times before. This is in the period where he was in a lot of pain, and he was doing a lot of drugs.
I hope you enjoyed part 1. Please continue to watch part 2 about songwriting as well. And don't forget to click subscribe and hit the bell to get notified about new videos of Songwriters Room, my new music, or Japanese series. Arigato!